Welcome to another episode of the Enter the Bible podcast, where you can get answers or at least reflections on everything you wanted to know about the Bible, but were afraid to ask. I'm Katie Langston.
And I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker. And we have as our very special guest this time, Professor John Levenson. He is the Albert List Professor of Jewish Studies at Harvard University. And my own teacher, Professor Levenson, was very graciously was my advisor in my doctoral studies at Harvard. And I just have great admiration for him. He has written widely on lots of different topics. His latest book is on the love of God. He's written on resurrection. He's written on law and covenant and the legacy of Abraham in a book called Inheriting Abraham. He is the author of countless essays and chapters and articles in various academic journals, and he has been long active in Jewish-Christian dialogue. I'm going to hold up a few books that he has written that I just happen to have in my office: Resurrection and the Restoration of Israel, The Ultimate Victory of the God of Life, and the Death and Resurrection of the Beloved Son, The Transformation of Child Sacrifice in Judaism and Christianity, and Creation and the Persistence of Evil, the Jewish Drama of Divine Omnipotence. That's just a few of the many books he's written. I would highly recommend you go to Amazon and check out all of them and ones that I haven't mentioned. So welcome, Professor Levenson. So glad that you joined us today.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Good.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, good to have you. We wanted to ask or talk about a topic that has to do with Christian-Jewish relations, particularly the practice of Christians reading what Christians call the Old Testament, what Jews call the Tanakh, what scholars call the Hebrew Bible. Is the practice of Christians reading the Hebrew Bible a case of reading someone else's mail? Can we ethically read these Hebrew scriptures?
Well, that's a complicated question, but a very important and intelligent question. I would say all modern communities are different from biblical Israel. Who the contemporary addressee is of the Hebrew Bible, the group known as the people of Israel, is not an empirical question. It's a matter of affirmation. People claim that status as part of a normative claim. It's not self-evident who those are. That ancient Israel, biblical Israel, in that sense, doesn't exist today. But what we have are successor communities that make a claim to inherit the status of Israel as defined in the Hebrew Bible. The church has long claimed to be the addressee. It's claimed to be the new Israel or the spiritual Israel, as opposed to the old Israel or the carnal Israel, which is the Jewish people, which in many Christian constructions are now dispensable, or whose continued existence is even an offense to God. So the church claims to be the new Israel engrafted on to the stock of Abraham, to use Paul's metaphor. And thus they claim to be the rightful addressee of what the New Testament calls the scriptures, hagiographe in Greek, the scriptures. The only scriptures the New Testament knows is the Old Testament.
Right.
The notion there's going to be a new Bible, I don't see that in the New Testament itself. Eventually, in the 2nd century, they began to have the pressure to produce a canon, and pressures began to develop to get rid of those Jewish scriptures because it represented a different God, supposedly. When that happened, Christians started referring to this as an Old Testament in binary opposition or in tandem, whatever, with a New Testament. But I think it's important to understand that the addressee in the Christian case is not universal humanity. It's not everybody on the face of the globe. It's not everybody descended from Noah or everyone descended from Adam. That was universal humanity. It's a very distinct subgroup of humanity, a very distinct subgroup, which is the church, that is to say, and again, use Pauline language, the body of Christ, or sometimes you hear in modern discourse, the people of God. So it makes a specific, particularistic claim. Some people say, well, Christianity is a universal religion, and Judaism is a particularistic religion. Both of them have their universal dynamic, and both of them have their particularistic dynamic. Christianity, more than Judaism over the millennia, has sought to convert the entire world to bring everybody under the aegis of its own particularism. That's a kind of infinite extension of a particularism. It's not just an affirmation of undifferentiated humanity. But both of them have their universal dimensions and their particular, or what do you want to call it, tribal dimensions. And each one of them has its own strategies for reading those common scriptures. In the church, you sometimes had the negative oracles, the oracles of judgment, the oracles of punishment applied to the Jews, and the positive oracles applied to themselves, to the church. Not always, but that was a common strategy in the early church. But I think it's fair to say it's very hard to make sense of the New Testament or Christianity in general apart from the Old Testament. I think it was the Swiss New Testament scholar Ernst Käsemann who said apocalyptic is the mother of Christian theology. I don't know if that's true of all Christian theology. It's certainly true. I would say Jewish apocalyptic is the mother of early Christian theology. And if one were to try to understand early Christian theology apart from the Hebrew Bible, well, good luck. Consider how often the scriptures, as they call them, are cited, reworked, echoed, or just not cited in the New Testament. So that's a particular Christian reading of that common scriptures. The Jewish people sees itself as Am Yisrael, the people Israel, and thus the addressee of the Bible. The addressee of the Hebrew Bible in the Jewish reading would be the Jews. And this is connected to notions of chosenness, of selection, of singling out. I don't like the Christian term it's often used. I think it's a little dangerous. Election. The problem with election is, I think a lot of Christians, when they hear the term the elect, they think it's those who are saved versus those who are damned.
Yeah.
Right.
Those headed for
that
heaven
does have
versus
that
those headed for perdition.
Yeah.
Whereas election in the Hebrew Bible and in Judaism generally usually doesn't mean that. It's not focused on questions of salvation. But there is a distinct group, which is the people of Israel, which is a kind of a natural family with a supernatural vocation. And in other words, both the natural and then supernatural Jew are part of that overall vocation of the Jewish people. And so I think a better term is probably something like chosenness, which you also have in the New Testament. You also have the notion that the church is the chosen people. And a lot of those texts like Exodus 19 and so forth are then reworked to apply to the church. Right. And in Judaism, you also have a continuing tradition. It's not just the religion of the Hebrew Bible. It certainly doesn't read the Hebrew Bible literally very often, as you, Professor Schifferdecker, remember from the various Midrash courses you suffered through with me, in all of which you starred. I once even had a student, I don't know if I ever told you this, I once had a student write on the student evaluation. He was annoyed that when I would ask a grammatical question, I would direct it to this one woman, and he met you, who always knew the answer. What he didn't realize was I didn't always direct it to her. I directed it to her when the others couldn't answer it. I didn't realize that I didn't automatically choose her. I would ask a grammatical question. Nobody would volunteer to answer. People would try to look down their books, sort of not indicate that they were vulnerable to a question. And then I would have to say Ms. Schifferdecker, who would 100% of the time get it right. But that's a digression. I can't remember what I was digressing from. But, Midrash.
So what is Midrash? I'm guessing some of our listeners won't know what that term means.
Well, it's not like eczema on the abdomen. It's not midrash or midriff rash, and it shouldn't be pronounced midrash. Midrash is the mode of interpretation of biblical verses in classical rabbinic Judaism. Say the Judaism of the Talmud and other works of rabbinic Judaism from, I don't know, 1st century CE through 5th, 6th century CE, in the land of Israel, in Roman Palestine, Roman occupied Palestine, and in Babylonia principally. And it's not plain sense interpretation. It's not plain sense exegesis. It's not literal. It's not carnal. It combines. It's a non-contextual associational logic that combines texts from hither and yon in the Hebrew Bible according to the way they sound outwardly, the way it sounds to the ear. it decontextualizes it from the immediate literary context. If it recontextualizes it so as to make a kind of new theological statement. And you see this all the time in the New Testament, by the way.
Sure.
Those who only approach the Hebrew Bible through historical criticism will miss this and say, "Oh, you're taking it out of context," missing the fact that it's another context and it generates a new context.
So it's a kind of creative interpretation. I mean, often these midrashim are really fun to read and often very insightful.
They're often insightful. They're very usually theologically driven.
Yeah.
They're fun to read. They're witty. There's a kind of buoyancy to them.
They're often stories, right? They'll elaborate on the stories or things that aren't necessarily in the text, but
that's right. They'll elaborate with the story. They'll fill in the gaps. The gaps in the Bible generate these midrashim. In other words, what is Abraham thinking when he's on the way to sacrifice his son? What interactions they have? Why does his son suddenly ask, "Hey, where's the sheep for the sacrifice?" What made him suddenly ask that? Well, they have this whole situation where a demon figure, a demonic, satanic type figure, tries to persuade Isaac and eventually Abraham to back down from this act of sacrifice. And so they have a whole narrative, as you say, a whole narrative that fills in that gap, because the Hebrew biblical narrative is so gapped, it's so terse, so spare. It calls forth these elaborations. So what I'm trying to make is that, as I see it, Judaism and Christianity are two sister communities that are appropriating a common scripture in ways that in some ways are parallel, in some ways are antithetical, neither of which is plain sense literalistic exegesis, neither of which is engaging in historical criticism. And these are, again, normative claims that are made that you can't just empirically determine, well, to whom is this addressed? So are Christians reading someone else's mail? Well, all moderns are reading someone else's mail. The question is, what's the strategy of appropriation? What do we build? What's the link we build to ourselves and antiquity? Or what's the chain of tradition we recognize as linking us to antiquity, so that we do have some claim on other people's mails? In other words, as I see it, both these communities need to recognize the existence of the other one,
right,
and its modes of interpretation. You don't have to accept them. I'm not pleading for religious relativism. I'm okay, you're okay, that sort of thing, or the kind of interfaith dialogue that's encapsulated in the hyphen in the word interfaith, or limited to the hyphen in the word interfaith. That's not what I'm calling for. But I think the degree to which they have their own interpretive procedures is key to figuring out, are you reading someone else's mail? In what sense is it your own mail?
Yeah, that's really helpful, Professor Levenson. I'm thinking, I want to go back to what you said just a few minutes ago about Christianity and Judaism as a kind of siblings, sisters. Because I remember hearing you say that at Harvard when I was a graduate student, and
who knew all the answers?
What's that?
I said, when you were a student who knew all the answers.
No. And it struck me, because I think before that, and I think probably some of our listeners think this too, that that Jews are directly descended from ancient Israel, or equivalent to ancient Israel, right? And that we are Christians are kind of the interlopers. I think that's why, that's the sense of the question, or how we phrase the question, right? Are we reading someone else's mail? Well, really, the Hebrew scriptures belong to the Jews, and we Christians are just, kind of interlopers. But what you said was, no, neither one is ancient Israel. They're both descended from ancient Israel.
Descended in different ways. I mean,
right.
Probably if you do a DNA test, you would find most Jews are descended from ancient.
Yeah, actually, physically, yeah.
Probably. On the other hand, some Jews are converts. Now, the process of conversion and what makes this Gentile into a Jew, you don't find that in the Hebrew Bible. You find that in Rabbinic Judaism. So that's what I mean by intermediating tradition that mediates and authorizes the normative claim. And Christians have an intermediate tradition. It's the whole tradition of the church. And they claim that baptism involves engrafting them into the line of Abraham. So in many ways, baptism for them is a kind of equivalent of circumcision and other conversion rituals of Judaism. There isn't some neutral world out there, or some neutral standard, neutral principles, which we say, oh, this one's legitimate, that one's not legitimate. Whether you think they're legitimate or not depends on the very fundamental affirmations of one's life. And I don't think one can empirically say. I've heard people say, I remember the late Michael Wishograd, who was a Jewish theologian and a personal friend of mine, said that, well, he really thinks he's very, very interested in Christianity, very pro-Christian in many ways, and wrote an essay in tribute to Karl Barth and so forth, which you rarely find a Jewish thinker doing. But he said, well, let's face it, because we say we try to observe the mitzvot, the commandments of the Torah, which rabbinic tradition enumerates as 613, you'd have to say there's more of a direct line of continuity with Judaism. Well, if the focus is on the Pentateuch, yes. If you assume that the way in which rabbinic tradition, Talmud, exegetes those commandments really is continuous with the commandments themselves, often it doesn't exactly seem that way, yes. But again, I see that as a normative claim. I don't see it as just as an obvious empirical claim. If you put the focus on apocalyptic literature, if you put the focus on, I don't know, Enoch literature or the book of Daniel or whatever, Ezekiel 38 through 39, you'd have to say an awful lot of Christianity has a kind of keen apocalyptic expectation, which appears from time to time in Judaism, and some Jews adhere to any given generation, but it's much, much less prominent in Judaism. Observance of the Torah, observance of the commandments, much more prominent in Judaism. Apocalyptic expectation, imminent, immediate expectation of resurrection of the dead. These are I think more alive in Christianity. So the way I see it, there's siblings in the sense that Judaism and Christianity, we call Judaism is rabbinic Judaism, is the Judaism of Talmud and Midrash. It emerges out of Second Temple Judaism for the last few centuries before the turn of the era. So both of these, Christianity and Judaism, emerge as similar responses to similar crises, and they both inherit in different ways the Hebrew Bible and the legacy of Second Temple Judaism. I think it's fair to say, I don't want to overgeneralize here because I certainly know of obvious and striking exceptions. By and large, I think most Christians read their Old Testament with much more distance, and really they generally don't know that they're not that much involved or committed to it. They see it as past, old in the sense of past. I don't think that was necessarily true in the early church. I think it's true for a lot of Christians today, but there are striking exceptions to that. And most Jews you meet today are really quite secular and know nothing about the Hebrew Bible and Jewish tradition.
I just want to add, I know we probably need to wrap up pretty soon, but the way that we phrase the question, right? Are we reading someone else's mail? I think that's probably more of a modern issue, right? Can we ethically read the Hebrew Bible?
Is it cultural appropriation?
Right. Is it, to use a modern term, is it cultural appropriation?
Well,
I think I think the older problem, for centuries before the modern era, is what you had mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, Professor Levenson, as Christians, kind of the opposite side of the coin, thinking that they've displaced Jews.
Yes.
Right. That it's no longer right. That Israel is no longer Israel, or we're the church is the new Israel, and we see that in the New Testament in some passages. The problem of supersessionism, right? I think that's the older problem.
That's the older problem, and it's still around.
Yes,
so I think that's very well put. I think it's exactly right. In terms of cultural appropriation, well, all cultures appropriate all kinds of things here. I mean, you go back in my family 5-6 generations ago, nobody spoke English. Am I engaging in cultural appropriation by speaking English or wearing Western clothes or whatever? Right. In other words, if you listen to jazz, I don't know anything about music. I do have an artist's ear for music. Unfortunately, it's Van Gogh's. But I understand there's a lot of dispute about what the sources of jazz are and the origins of it, and a lot of different communities claim it. But if someone plays it, and does that mean they're appropriating? I think culture appropriate. I think the question is, what's the responsible way to appropriate? Not is it appropriation? Anyone who attempts to read anything from the past is appropriating something that's not obviously, distinctly, immediately theirs. But you're absolutely right, Katie is 100% right that both of you, that the deeper issue is the supersessionism. In other words, by what right did the Jews read the Hebrew Bible the way they do, rather than reading it Christologically or typologically or predictively, the way it tends to be read by Christians, especially Christians with a keen eschatological expectation, expecting the end time. That's the more difficult question.
Well, and that's a whole topic for another podcast, I suppose. But I would just point our listeners to, if you're interested in that question of relationship of Judaism and Christianity, to read Romans chapters 9 through 11, where Paul, who is himself a Jew, I think this is probably too obvious to say, but Jesus was a Jew. All the early Christians were Jews, including Paul, right? Paul is wrestling with this question of, what about my people? What, if they don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, are they still saved? And he wrestles with this, and he finally comes, and there's different interpretations of those chapters, but he comes to the conclusion that the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable, right? That God is faithful to Israel, to the original Israel, as well as to the church. And he calls for humility, that Christians are just wild olive branches grafted into the root, the olive tree of Israel, so that then we can't brag, we have to be humble. So I would point our listeners to those chapters, because they're really
I think that's right. And I mean, if you think about it, if you think it's based on, we'll use that word election, you can't really take credit for election, right? You can't, if you see yourself as loved or beloved or the chosen, did you generate that? Is that your own merits that generated that? I mean, clearly not. So I think that's his point. My own hunch about Paul in Romans 9-11, which I've thought about a great deal, is I think it's a kind of protest against a certain kind of theological anti-Semitism on the part of the Gentiles, boasting at the expense of the Jews. I think the Jews have been radically, permanently cut off. But I also think that he believes that in the end time, which he thinks is coming very soon, the Jews will be re-engrafted in, and the whole world will then acclaim Christ. Because I think he does foresee, God has not abandoned those Jews, but I think he does think there's going to be a fulfillment of those covenantal promises in terms of what we might say in modern terms is conversion to Christianity at the end time, and the eschatological consummation, the end time consummation. That's my guess as to what he means. But he certainly objects to this sort of bragging. If you're able to read someone else's mail, it's only because you've been graciously granted that gift. You can't really take credit for.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So there's a call for humility. And I think you're right. He probably does envision some mass conversion or something, but I think he leaves it up to the mystery of God, right? He's not.
Yes, he does. That's right.
And the important thing in that passage is, God is faithful, right? So if God could abandon the Jews, then what, why do you think God wouldn't abandon the church? So it's a theological, assertion. God is faithful. God doesn't abandon the Jews.
That's right. If you abandon your old friends, your new friends are not going to trust you.
Right. Exactly.
That's part of the problematic that he's wrestling with there.
Right.
So I agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we could talk for a long time. I know we're not going to exhaust the topic of Judaism and Christianity and their relationship, but hopefully our listeners got a taste for that. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Enter the Bible podcast. Get high quality courses, commentaries, resources, videos, and reflections at enterthebible.org. Thanks for joining us.